Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Speaking Bones, chapters 47 through 49. In these chapters, oh my god, guys, I think Firo is dead. I wasn't ready for it at all. At the very least, we have this little asshole who tried to scam everybody getting got. Thank you. Something. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Kyle for commissioning this episode. I just realized that I announced the chapters, but not the names of them. So 47 is a riddle, 48 is books, and 49 is bookmaking. So I just want to give my impression overall of these chapters. And I want to preface this by saying I understand that this is a draw, probably, for a lot of people. And I am not saying that this is a flaw. I'm saying that I think maybe it's not for me. I have kind of reached a point where there is so much description of the gadgets in the story and the progression of technology that I think it's genuinely beginning to overshadow the main story for me. This is something that up until the first third of this book, you guys know that I have been fascinated by the ways in which this author has created what feels like very possible technological advances and gizmos, for lack of a better word, found ways to show us the creation of energy sources or the discovery of them and the ways in which they are utilized. And I think that what I liked a lot, and I still do like this aspect, is how often these technologies are being utilized for something that is really mundane or under noticed, like the Silkmotic, current, and the way that was just being used by some guy on the street doing weird shit to make a little bit of pocket change from passing. He was basically a busker. And then this turns into a nation-changing force. And similarly, we have this whole thing where the automation and creation of many items identically all at once, this is the Industrial Revolution. This is going to be a complete sea change in the way things are manufactured in this world eventually. But the reasons that this was invented to begin with, the original attempt was simply to win a restaurant cook-off, right? And I know that in the last book, a lot of people were kind of from what I heard, obviously, this is not something that I'm not in the fandom because of the way that I have to cover the books and not be spoiled. But from what I understand from when Kyle was in the chat, there were a lot of people who sort of got impatient with the cook-off thing, and I get it, but I was enjoying it. I think mostly because I'm a foodie and I just found that aspect of it really fascinating in that sense. But when I step back and look at how I would probably have felt about that plotline if it were about anything other than cooking, then I can see how folks would get impatient with it. That is sort of where I'm at right now. I feel like the start of this series, I was so deeply invested in the characters and who they are and what their motivations are and the sense of justice that a lot of them were pursuing and attempts to make the world a genuinely better place. And I've lost a little bit of that. There are still characters in the midst of everything that I like and care about, but I don't feel like they are getting their due time on stage, so to speak. And I am spending so much more time like with the descriptions of how a writing implement is used and it's just, I feel, and I may be wrong, this may, if you actually empirically go through the books and take out the sections that are describing the creation of certain mechanical devices and advances, it may be incorrect. But it feels like we're spending 50% more time on that than we used to. And I'd be very curious about any like info out there, if anyone else feels the same way, if there has been any sort of comparison like that done by a fandom like who's very intense about it, because there are people out there for whom fandom is a science and they will go through and like just fucking track down info and find out, you know what I mean? Like it's, what I'm saying is it's very possible that somebody has looked into it. But I just really, and I want to be clear about this, that I'm not trying to say that I don't find it at all interesting. But what I have been mostly here for are the people. And their creations, while fascinating and really fun, have lost a little bit of their magic because they have been so central to everything that it's almost like the visionary quality of like the rulers or the people who are trying to take the world in a new direction, it feels like they are secondary to engineers, and that maybe that is on purpose. Maybe that is because, like, you know, one could say that the people who program the technology that we use today essentially decide the direction the world goes in. So that may be completely intentional. But for me, I don't find it as compelling. And there really reached a point for me where not only did it seem like we were focusing on this too much, but the author was repeating himself. I really think this book suffers from a lack of editing. And this happens so often with so many authors that manage to like become pretty successful, is their books begin to expand and expand and expand. And sometimes there's good reason. And sometimes that reason is simply they got famous enough that people went more hands off with editing. And there is a lot that I felt we didn't need to be told again because I understood. And it just seemed like the author is so intent on making sure that we understand every single step that we took along the way, when I don't think we need to see every step. We, at this point, understand the way these books tend to shake out. And the way that is that somebody like makes a sort of discovery about a thing that they can do with technology for a small purpose that is very personal to them. And somebody is like, you know, I need to do X, Y, and Z, and that would be impossible. And the person who has invented this small thing is like, but wait, I could apply what I have done here to what you're talking about. And ta-da, now we have a whole fleet of whatever that we can use. And I don't need to see every step in that goes into creating it. So the difference here too, it's like when I'm bringing up the way that, for example, they figured out how the Gorinophins create fire from their mouths. That was really fascinating because we have like the biology of these creatures, which are dragons, but dragons are always, because they're mythical creatures, that any author is going to have a different take on them than others. So we got to learn the way in which this author interpreted dragons and the way he explained what it is that they do, breathing fire. We got to see the way that the scientists who dissected them understood the way this worked and began to recreate that in an artificial setting. And then the ways in which they utilize that in war. And that has, it's a transference from like a completely biological situation to something mechanical, which is in itself a major change that's really interesting. Plus, the Ryugu seemed pretty fucking monstrous, and so I'm like, fully, yes, let's do this. I want to take these assholes down, find a way to use their own creatures against them somehow. But here, the major thing is, I'm figuring out how to write lots of books at once. And I gotta tell you guys, I didn't think that we were going to see this because I thought we had already kind of been told how this was going to go. And so having a lot of detail about the individual logograms and the way that they are detected with this light and everything, not only do I not fully understand it when I'm just reading about it, I need to see this sort of thing. It needs to be a little bit more visual for me to really get it. But it just felt like, yeah, I know. Even though I don't know the specifics about the way that this was done and working it into a grid work in a similar way as a knitting pattern and the bee and the way its multifaceted eyes work. It's not like that was already happening. It simply felt like it was a chore to sit through the discovery of it because we have done this many times by now. So I was feeling pretty impatient with it. And I am really, it's surprising because as somebody who tends to like logistics so much, when I get to a point where I'm like, all right, enough, you know that it's been a lot. And I think that it's a similar thing as with like really, really heavily explained magical systems. Some people are here for that. And I like my magical systems to be internally, what's the word I want? Consistent. I like for there to be like a really clear basis. And if you deviate from that, I need it to be very clearly explained why. And that is an outlying situation and, all of that. But I don't need a complete explanation of every step of it. And I feel like that is happening with the tech because that's basically the magic of this universe. I trust that these engineers created this, and I know that it's sort of an arbitrary line to draw that at this point in the story, after all of the many things that he has explained in detail, I'm going, okay, we don't need this. But I just feel like it's beginning to overtake things a little. And it may simply be my personal reaction, and it is not actually true if you look at the text. But I'm sorry to front load this with like a criticism. I don't like coming in negative because I actually liked these chapters overall. It's just that I read this section twice, and within those two listens, because I was listening to the audiobook, I had to rewind so many times and re-listen because I was not getting a thing. It was like sliding right off of my brain, and I was failing to fully like grasp it, or even get to a place where I was like wanting to grasp it. And I just need you all to understand where I'm coming from in my mindset and the way that I'm talking about this, because I am going to talk about the chapters and low-key skip over the details about the creation of this new technology, because it's so uninteresting for me at this point. You know, we've got Savo, and we have, oh my God, I keep wanting to say Rati, right? And I trust the two of them. They've been in the mix with this sort of thing before. I believe they can come up with this. It doesn't feel that far outside of other things that they have made. I'm good. And that's all I need. And I think the main feeling for me now is that there are so many balls in the air that I'm really starting to want some like conclusions on a few things, some closure. So let's start with chapter 47. The whole thing that happens with like Tom Vanaki, and you guys know that I am still in shock, basically, that everybody who was involved with this entire situation is dead. I had just never expected Timu to die. I had not expected, if Tom Vanaki died, I was going to be surprised, but Timu, it was straight up not on the map for me. I really thought he would survive. So when we start off back here, this whole thing, Tom Vanaki's mount, whose name is Corva, breaks out of her pen and flies into the ocean. She plunged in, throwing up a distant eruption like the spout of a Krubin. The waves closed over the spot, and she did not reappear. It was a most inauspicious sign. And my feeling here is that she had such a soul link to this dragon that when she died, the dragon could sense it. I think that's what's being said here. But it was very sad. Like, the whole situation with Tom Vanaki, which we'll get into a little bit later because there's an interesting conversation with Ghost Tom Ryoto that I want to talk about, but it's really frustrating. So Noda Mi, this fucking piece of filth, has concocted this story that is just so far-fetched that it's really remarkable that anybody at all is buying it. Really, the only thing that I think works about it is that there are factions that are so at each other's throats that he is able to dodge their scrutiny by simply like getting them distracted with one another and focused on one another. And so that manages to sort of save the day for him. But when it comes to his own, like, the whole way that he tries to present this is, I got knocked out from the start, and so I don't know what happened. And when I came up awake, a bunch of things had happened. And that is already, there are so many instances of people trying to claim this kind of thing, you guys. It is hilarious. Like, I was just listening to an episode of the podcast Snapped, Women Who Kill, which is like my low-key favorite podcast right now. And the number of women who have like, a really, really common thing about women conspiring to murder people in this show is that they will attempt to manipulate another person to do it for them. And oftentimes this is a combination of they can't bear to because the person's close to them, and so they feel just enough guilt not enough to stop them, but just enough that they can't do it. Secondly, that person is stronger because usually they're trying to kill their husband. And third, they need enough of a separation between themselves and the person doing it that it doesn't look like it could be tied back to them. But of course it always is. And just the one that I was listening to yesterday, this woman had like conspired with these dudes to kill her husband. And when they're like, this doesn't make any, the cops are like, this doesn't make any sense. You're claiming that you didn't know this and that. She then like created this whole, well, I took an Ambien before I went to sleep. And so I remember this and that, but it's all really hazy and unclear. And I thought that it was a dream. Of course it did not work. The court was not buying it and she went away for 50 years. But, that was what I kept thinking of here. And as Noda Mi recounted this tale through tears and snot, he pulled off his tunic to show the dark bruise where the bullet had struck him on the shoulder. The fall might have saved his life. While the traitors and rebel slaves attacked the rest of the party furiously, they seemed to have paid no more attention to his immobile body. Still, as combatants fought near him, an occasional sword strike or club swing must have landed on him. Here, Noda Mi pointed to the various wounds covering his face and body. The ferociousness of the battle could well be imagined from these merely accidental hits. Sir, I am going to need you to tone it down several notches. Oh my God. By the time he finally awakened, the battle was over. The attackers were nowhere to be seen, but they left behind a field of corpses. And then, of course, once he tells them where this all happened, they go and there's no corpses. And so now it has to be like, oh, they must have covered their tracks. Nah. And the most merciful, most beauteous, most wise and redoubtable and formidable and revered sovereign in the history of the universe, Pekuvaju Roatan, protector of Dara, and the most loyal, most thoughtful, most hard-working and far-seeing and omniscient and steadfast counselor in the breadth and height of the world, Thane Kutanrovo Aga, wearer of the Lurian Rio Lurotan, and had perished. Oh dear Votan! Oh, curse the gods! Oh, woe is us! Here, some of the gathered Thanes and Naros Votans shook their heads impatiently. They looked with undisguised contempt at Noda, face covered in tears and mucus, fists drumming helplessly against the ground. The pitiful cur really could grate on one's nerves. So then we have the letter that Timu left for his family, written at sword point. And this was, I have sort of mixed feelings about this simply because it's a thing we have seen before. And I feel like I'm being a little hard on it because just since we've seen it before doesn't mean that it doesn't work or anything. I think it was the sort of slow reveal of the way that this riddle is unraveled. I was sort of feeling like, yeah, I know, like, this is the way that this has gone before. There is no way reading that letter that there's not a bunch of codes embedded in it. Like, you can tell it's written really weirdly. So it just took so long to kind of get there that I was feeling a little bit frustrated. And I think that just the theme for me at this point in this book is a feeling of impatience with Ken Liu's writing, because I feel like he is really taking his time in a way that worked when we were getting the sort of stage established, or we were like when he was letting readers know the different ways that certain things could be approached. But now we know that things can be approached this way. It's not as much of a surprise, and it feels like he's writing it as though it should be a surprise. So I think that's when I'm saying, like, we've seen this before. The reason that I'm saying this, like, with that tone of frustration, writing something being done more than once is not inherently bad. But when you write it as if it's going to be a big shock the second time or the third time, it starts to be, irritating as a reader because I'm already ahead of you, and that's never really a good feeling. I think that's like where I come down a lot of times where I talk about, like, I don't want to feel like I'm smarter than my main character. This is a similar thing, even though it's not about the main character. I don't want to be sitting around as a reader, metaphorically speaking, waiting for everybody on the page to catch up with something that I've already figured out. The only, like, the exception to that is when we have been explicitly told something and it's being made clear that everybody else is being deceived, and we're just like watching things unfold, understanding that these people have been misinformed on purpose, and that's the way things are meant to go. But the way this is written is that it's supposed to be as much of a surprise for the reader as it is for Noda Mi. Maybe that's not what he intended, but that's how it reads. And it wasn't. I just kept waiting for him to get to the point because we knew, I'm sure I'm not the only one, that this wasn't what it looked like, right? So I'm so sorry because you guys, I said like I enjoyed these chapters, and I did, but like I am running into this at this point in the book, and I'm not really. I think, my irritation with the way that Tanvanaki seemed to sort of turn into a different character when it was time for her to fall for this trap, and just completely like overlooking all of the very clear waving red flags and everything. And Timu dying, as much as I like the fact that surprised me, and I didn't think that he was even an option for death, and then we went ahead with it anyway. I like that element of like, shit's not going how you think. Tropes are one thing, but then there's being predictable, and I'm not about that, and I admire that. But there is a point where I'm going, okay, but is that surprising in a way that feels organic, or is it surprising because so much has felt sort of like it's coming out of left field entirely? And I don't know, but I'm just, I really would like to hear from people listening to this, how you felt at this point, because I know that the way that I go through these books is very different from the way that most people read. I am going slowly, a few chapters at a time, with long breaks between where I can chew on those chapters. I take an hour to talk about them, which like most people just fucking mainline something. And it's very easy to forgive or overlook or simply not stop to think about a certain thing because it's falling behind you as you're moving on to the next major plot point. So the frustration that I am feeling may not be something other people felt at all. I am just trying to be really honest with you guys when I say that my overall sense of impatience at this point is sort of beginning to infect everything. And I don't like that. And I am trying to resist that because I know it's not exactly fair. But to a degree, I can only help that so much. And I'm just trying at this point to assess whether or not I'm justified or if this is just me, for whatever reason, having an issue. So he reads this letter that is like very flowery and written in such a strangely contrived way that it's setting off all kinds of alarm bells. And what really like comes down later is that Diana, who is Timu's daughter, recognizes the handwriting, so she knows it's of her father, but then later on begins to analyze the way that it's written and the strange phrasing of things and begins to pull an underlying message out of it. So there's a bunch of like back and forth where people are talking about how Kutan Rovo is plotting against the Peikyu, and because like there aren't bodies, so folks aren't even really sure that they're dead. It's a very bizarre situation. And And Noda Mi is feeling really high on himself because what he wanted to do was sow discord, create such a sense of confusion that nobody trusted one another, that everybody was at each other's throats, and that way, in all of that chaos, there would be an easy out where he could slip away and nobody would be paying attention because there's so much infighting and paranoia about completely unrelated things. And he gets up in the middle of the night and he goes to the tent of these kids. And there, you guys, before we even get to that, there is another really like terrible series of torturings. And you could, I just, again, do we need this? They lined up terrified natives and demanded to know if anyone had participated in the rebellion. When no satisfactory answers were given, they picked victims at random and unleashed their wrath. They piled stones on white-haired elders until they slowly suffocated and bashed babies' skulls in front of their parents. They committed ritualized rapes, castrations, disembowelments, flayings. And I'm just like, look, I get it. But also, do we have to? Noda Mi stole through Creefy, ignoring the groans and moans emanating from the tents he crept past. Creefy was barely functioning. And he goes into the little tent and, let's see, Goztan asked Toju in a sleepy voice. Goztan, as the sole Garinifinthane left, should have been in charge of the aftermath. The fractious hardliners, however, had refused to submit to her authority, and the Garinifinthane had disappeared from Creefy. Rumors were she had brought a band of warriors loyal to her Kigo Yezu in the hopes of ferreting out the truth. So he comes and he gets Toju and Diana, and I think it's just the two of them, right? I keep thinking that Timu has 3 children, but I don't think he actually does. So Toju is really trying to like embody the vibe of the Ryukyu and is getting when Noda Mi is attempting to like convince him we're leaving for your safety. Toju is digging in and being like, well, fuck that. If you know who killed my parents, who killed my parents, I want to face them. I'm not going to shame my mother by running away. We're going to fight. And Noda is like, God damn it. I really should have known this was going to be how it works. So then he has to sort of be like, well, it's going to be like that story. We're strategically retreating. So he convinces Toju, and pausing from time to time to hide from the few Naros out of their tents, the 3 stole away undetected. And they go down to the beach, and there is nobody at all on the beach, which right away I was sort of like, this feels like a trap. This is awfully convenient. Of course, for Noda, he's just like, I'm such a genius. Of course there's nobody here because I'm amazing. So the moment that comes here, he's like rushing them to get into the boat, and Diana says, Uncle Noda, did my father cry for very long after my mother died? This is a trick question, but Noda is so distracted right now that he doesn't pick up on the tone, because I think that he would have. He wouldn't have, like, there's a sound to somebody's voice when they're trying to be casual, but they're desperate for your answer. And I have to think it's just that he is so paranoid about getting caught that he is not listening. And he says, of course, he wept like a baby. And he told you to keep us safe? Yes. Now get on board. So they act like, oh, of course, we're getting on board. And then all of a sudden she stops and points and is like, oh, who's that? And he sees somebody and is like, well, I don't need a witness. So he's heading over to bash their head in, thinking that it's like one person. And then he comes around the corner and it is 10 Ryukyu. And when he turns to run, there's another bunch of them behind him. And it's Goztan Ryoto. And I love this. Her voice seemed more tired than triumphant. Your endless betrayals are finished. And of course he starts accusing her of all kinds of shit. She just says, bind him. You are hereby charged with treason against Ukuta Asa and the murder of Pekuvaju and Garinafinthin Kotunrovo. How do you plead? And he asks for proof. And this is when Timu's daughter steps forward. And she explains that in the sentence you just read, the word gentle has been severed from ruler and placed at the opposite end of the line, much as you severed my father's head and took it away. And he starts laughing like this, you're reading into this too much. My father was a skilled and erudite writer. He and I often entertained ourselves with logogram riddles. Though he couldn't write in logograms for this letter, he adapted his techniques to the phonetic script. The phrase that divides gentle from ruler is a faithful shepherd who has renounced the staff. What is a shepherd without a staff? The logogram for shepherd is written like so, formed of 3 semantic roots, a hooked staff on the right, a chaser, plus fleece on the left. If we remove the staff, what is left is simply fleece chaser, a sheepdog. And a faithful sheepdog is my father's way of referring to you. And Noda is starting to be like, oh my fucking God, because he had never bothered with language. He had never bothered to learn the different, myths and stories either, which that comes up in a moment. So there's a lot that he didn't educate himself on that made it so that he could be tricked into doing this. And then, you must see this as a mistake. How could I be his killer when I was knocked unconscious? You just told me. You saw my father weeping for my mother. I was testing you. And why didn't you reveal Kutanrovo's role in this plot until now? Ghostan asked. Because I was terrified. You're right about Kutanrovo plotting, but you're also part of that plot. And once again, Diana held up her father's letter. Only in a crisis do we see the truth that lies deep within the human heart, like a beam of moonlight illuminating the ghostly flocks drowning in the still water at the bottom of a well, crying out silently. And she says, do you know what he was quoting? It was the paraphrase of a line from a poem. And it was Vokufirna who died. I was sad when he died. And it says, he sometimes used the image of a moonlit well filled with death as a synecdoche for Kutanrovo, because Kutanrovo was the thane of the flock of the Nyalyufin. I'm going to look up Schenectady because Schenectady is the name of a place in New York. A type of metonym, a figure of speech in which a term for a part of something is used to refer to the whole. The term is derived from ancient Greek. Okay, that is not helpful. It would be super cool if somebody could just... A figure of speech was made... So I've got a bunch of examples here in images. Like, do you like my new wheels? Instead of, do you like my car? Oh, interesting. All hands on deck refers to the whole crew of a ship, but only mentions their hands. The White House announced refers to the U.S. government, but only mentions the White House. Interesting. Okay. Sorry about that detour, guys, but when I was listening to it, I was like, oh yeah, remember to look that up, and then I had forgotten to do it. So the emperor placed your name within the same paragraph in which he refers to Kutanrovo. This was also the same paragraph in which he described the enemies attacking him in the Pekyu. In this way, he revealed you and Kutanrovo were co-conspirators. When Zazatika came to me with her suspicions, I believed her but couldn't do much. An accusation framed through riddles could not convince the other thanes, so I had to create the impression no one was watching you and observe what you would do. And at this point, They find the heads. He's just got them in the boat. And of course, poor Diana loses her mind, but not as bad as her brother, it turns out. I can help you pacify the natives and become Peikyu. And he's like really misinterpreting. He thinks that he can appeal to Ghost Town Ryoto the same way that he could to Kutonrovo, like that she has the same sort of ambition. Ghost Town Ryoto just wants to be able to live without this hideous violence that's been happening. She is sick of this and isn't reveling in it like Kutonrovo did. She doesn't want the power like Kutonrovo did. It's just not about this for her, which we see later because she's like, Diana, you're going to be Peikyu, and doesn't even want it. But I love it. He's like, I swear I'll be loyal. And she just says, treason is in your nature. And without warning, bashes in his head. And I was just like, thank you, God. Ugh, enough of this guy. So Ghost-han comes to see Diana and talks to her about her mother and the fact that Diana has some qualities that her mother also had. And she says, your brother cannot be handed the signaling spear for the people of Ukitaasa. Reluctantly, Diana nodded. Toji's mind, already fragile from Tolyusa thirst, unbeknownst even to his own family, he had become addicted to the enhanced Tolyusa supplied by Kutonrovo, had collapsed under the weight of the revelations of last night. Kutonrovo, the warrior he worshipped as a paragon of Ryukyu virtue, had been plotting against his own mother. Timu, the man whose blood tie he had always despised, had avenged his wife by writing the truth with his blood. Noda Mi, the one native he trusted, had been trying to use him like a hunting trophy. He had erupted into violence, lashing out his guards and screaming that he would avenge his dead mother by killing everyone in sight. Ghost-han had no choice but to have him bound and gagged. And I really don't know what happens to him. I was sort of thinking about it like, where do you go next after you tie this kid up and set him aside and get his sister to be Peikyu? Like, I don't think a kid that has been fed the kind of toxic shit that he has is going to be okay with his sister taking his place. I feel like the only execution would be the only thing I would think if we were dealing with regular Ryukyu, but we're dealing with a mishmash here. And I don't know if Diana's going to want to or be able to do that, you know? And Ghost-han tells her, your mother could tell true stories apart from false ones and was empathetic to feel what they feel. And Diana is like, she tells true stories from false ones, but she didn't see through Kutonrovo, and she didn't feel anything for my father while he like fell apart because everything was imploding. She failed because she lacked an even more essential quality: the courage to live true to one's nature. Your mother lived in the shadow of her father, believing that she had to fulfill his dream of Ryukyu supremacy. Fearful that she would appear weak, she hardened her heart against the suffering of the native people and willfully blinded herself to the consequences of her actions. It's interesting because I do like that interpretation. We know that when we were inside Kutonrovo, or not, Tamanaki's head, she was disgusted by a lot of the things that she saw happening, and she did make herself just ignore it. But it is weird that she could tell a true story from a false one and literally walks into the most obvious trap. I just find it a weird choice on the author's behalf, and I think maybe that's supposed to be the point, is that she finally grew so blinded by her own unwillingness to face the truth that she fell for a trap when in better times she may not have done that. But I can't say that it worked for me as a reader. It just felt out of character. The whole thing felt so obviously set up that, and that may be, again, intentional, but I just don't really buy it. So Diana asks, what is your ambition if you don't want to rule? And she says, I don't think I would call it ambition. I wish for the Liuku and Dara and the natives to become the people of Ukutaasa. Kutanrovo thought that a betrayal of my people, but I think it's the only vision grand enough for the Liuku spirit. Diana nodded. You speak of a devotion to ever-enlarging circles of empathy, of a yearning for new identities that transcend old enmities. Among my father's people, there's a word for that. Mutaje. Mutaje. Interesting. That's not the way Vokufirna explained the word to me, but I see that it fits. And she says, at this point, there's another thing my father mentioned. Carry on the legacy of your father and hope will glow in your hands like iced Tolusa. The native word for Tolusa is Zomi. The classical Ano word means pearl of fire, but the fire were put out by ice, then what's left in our hands is simply a pearl. The name of my uncle, the Emperor of Dara, means pearl in the palm. My father always told me that unlike my implacable grandmother, his brother had a deep streak of mercy that can be reached. Appealing to my uncle instead of my grandmother is our best chance of surrendering without losing everything. You guys, is Fira really dead? I don't want him to be really dead. I just hate this because it feels like this is really what they're leaning on here, I don't know. So, let me go to 48. A secluded seaside villa by Lutho Beach. And we have this really interesting decision that has happened. All over Dara, messenger pigeons landed at the story halls of Veterans Mutual Benefit Societies. The directions contained in the bamboo tubes were cryptic, but as they were signed by the personal seal of the missing Emperor Monodetu, his followers carried them out faithfully. Under cover of night, tattooed Aduan gangsters snuck into warehouses at Ginpen's harbor to retrieve unlabeled boxes from obscure corners and loaded them onto ships bound for all quarters of the compass. From Tawaza to Muning, from Boama to Karuza, stevedores unloaded the boxes and stacked them on carts and caravans bound for cities and towns in the interior. Discharged veterans employed in private security and public town watches received the boxes from caravan drivers and unpacked them in the middle of the night, then turned the contents over to their sons and daughters, many of whom were clerks or household servants for people of power. And when these lords of Dara came to work in the morning, they found stacks of books on their desks. So we go then to the POV of, what is his name? Sorry. As the spouse of Munkakri, first general of the infantry and one of Emperor Ragan's earliest and most decorated followers, Narohun could have lived a life of ease and luxury. So this dude, long story short, is just a good, solid follower of orders. But his ultimate loyalty is to the good of the nation, not to a particular ruler. So he has, retired to a good position because he was able to see what was written on the wall with the fact that Gia doesn't have any love for the martial aspect of rule, and was all right, you know what, I'm going to make myself scarce and just put myself somewhere where I can have enough power and, be comfortable and raise children, but I won't draw attention to myself. And he gets these books and he's like, this is interesting. And when he opens it, the first thing that he notices is this is written flawlessly. The calligraphy is absolutely without error. And yet, it's very distinctly Sato's handwriting. He recognizes it, which is really interesting to me that, you know, and this makes sense, but it's something that I have never lived during an era where this would have been something that anybody would have been able to rely on, because by the time I was born, print was such a thing. The concept of recognizable handwriting amongst officials and counselors and royalty, that's such an interesting concept that, like, oh, well, everybody knows your handwriting, which is what is said later to Sato. And she's like, well, yeah, granted. And I was like, wow, what is that like? And when he's like looking through this, he realizes, oh shit, this is official if it's coming from her. So we jump over to the future after that he has read them. And his son is going, why are you doing this? Haven't you said we should always stay out of court politics? And he's like, I have. We should focus on what's right in front of us. And, you know, but at this point, we're talking about what's right. And we have to, regardless of the consequences, face up to what's been going on, even if we think that the country's been doing well under the Empress's care. And I cop to that. I admit that that is true. And he's like proud of his son for calling him out on this a little bit. But he's like, we can't just ignore what's been said here. And he resigns as the mayor. And then in chapter 49, we go back in time 3 months earlier to, I'm sorry, I kept saying Sato, but it's Soto. We go back in time to the moments in which this plan was orchestrated. And like I said, I really didn't think that we needed to go into as much detail as is gone into here. But I'm going to talk about this a little bit. I have a little less than like 10 minutes left. So, oh my God. Let's see. Widow Wasu is here. I love when she's talking about Kunigaru and the way that she was like able to fill his beer gut. As she was like, if I could fill the bottomless pit that was his expanding beer gut, I certainly don't mind feeding you and your young man, which I thought was very disrespectful, but hilarious. He would probably have loved it. You just stay put and do whatever you want to do. If that Gia gives me any trouble, I've got a good speech prepared on what Konfiji said about the proper role of a first wife and aunt mother. I would love to see that, and what Gia would even respond to that. Meanwhile, Savo tried to stay out of Firo's way. Though the young emperor was friendly and open toward his sister's intended, knowing the role Firo played in Dara's war, he found it difficult to face the martial emperor with equanimity. He shrank back from Firo's embrace of violence in the pursuit of justice, first in regard to the Liuku and now to avenge his mother. But he was also keenly aware that his own pacifism was a luxury, made possible only because he was living under the peace of Empress Gia and shielded by Widow Wasu's generous heart. How could he presume to tell the people of Dara what was justice? And I do appreciate that he at least has this self-awareness. So we have Firo saying, I'm glad that Savo and now you have found wisdom in the teachings of Rufizo Mender, but in the real world, a blood debt must be repaid with blood. How can I leave my mother's death unanswered? No philosophy could overcome the power of a heartfelt truth, and there was a gulf between the siblings that could not be bridged by words. Firo departed, but left word that members of the Blossom Gang might stop by from time to time. Soto spent much of her time at the Villa in isolation, setting down in wax what she knew of Gia's secret machinations and misdeeds. Terrified that Gia was going to find her and silence her forever, she wanted to leave behind a manuscript. And then we have the conversation between Soto and Farah, where they talk about the ways in which we could hold her accountable. Farah, at first, is like, well, we should put her on trial. And Soto's like, she's a fucking empress. How do you even do that? She's just above the law. Like, nobody is going to risk her disfavor in case she does get away with it and have been the one to rule against her. Like, that's not going to work. And Farah's then like, well, you could tell the prime ministers the truth. And Soto's like, look, all of them, if they even believed me, they would know this would throw Dara into chaos. And they might even seek to keep me from being heard and silence me along with her. And she says, well, what if you told everyone? And Soto's like, told everybody. All the rumors about shit she has pulled have been floating around forever. It's not like she's gone completely under the radar with the way she's behaved. It's simply that nobody can actually prove anything. So if I just circulate a bunch of rumors, that's not anything she hasn't already been dealing with for literally years. And Farah's like, yeah, but they didn't have a source. If you say it, and she's like, how do I personally tell everybody? And she says, well, writing it down. And they would recognize your handwriting. It's very specific. And Soto's like, yeah, sure. And if I had Gin's trial manuscript and Zomi's retraction and Rinkoda's suicide note, I mean, that would all help. But I could only write one book. They get a hold of that one book and destroy it, and that's it. I mean, come on. It would take a long time to circulate it. We don't have that kind of time. And then we have Savo hearing in his head, the words that she said, I can only write one book. So then we have Rati Yera arriving. And yada, yada, yada. We have the creation of this machine that makes multiple books at once. And I know that it's sort of like dismissive, but I said some things about the Bumblebee and its, fractal sight and everything. I will say, though, I really do appreciate Ratiera as a character and the fact that I really just don't want her to die within the story. I don't know how much time we're going to span from here on, because up to now we've been spanning like multiple generations. So I would have said we were going to have to see her death if we were earlier in the series. But knowing this is the final book, I'm hoping that she just is alive to the end, because she's really been put through it. And getting to see the way that her teachings and her ideas have been able to live on is really cool. So let's see. A mechanical orchestra, another level of abstraction, another way to teach and learn, to multiply the work of one adept 100-fold. In principle, Rati explained that in her exploration of the art of automata construction, two principles had proven to be helpful. The first was higher abstraction, the primitive system of individual wheel turns that defined the capability of the instructable carts threatened to overwhelm the pilot until abstracted into a system of compound knots that could be strung together to represent a map. The primitive language of punched holes that specified each minute aspect of the wing beat of an ornithopter was impossible to use to write a flight plan until it was abstracted into the higher language of pseudologograms that represented numbers, directions, and degrees. The second principle was imbuing machines with wisdom. Whether it was the self-adjusting feedback loop powering the even-tempered Archon, or the human intelligence encoded in the knot map and the master quark cylinder, marvelous automata, I'd never know how to do that, were made possible by reifying wisdom, reducing experience and practiced routine into precise instructions that could be carried out by a machine repeatedly and at high speed. So she begins to create this format. And let's see. Farah had taken up gardening. While pruning a beech rose bush, she noticed a hefty bumblebee crawling over a dandelion flower at her feet. The insect was so large that the thin stalk of the flower was unable to support it, swaying back and forth precariously as the bumblebee shifted from one side to the other, scrambling to hold on like a drunken sailor clinging to the mast, or a tyrant struggling to remain on her throne. Really? Like that? I'm just saying. So this is when she creates the knitting pattern. And when, I love this, Savo sees it and he's like, why did you break it down into squares like that? Your sketch is way prettier. And she's like, well, this is how you have to do it. I'm working with yarn here. And he's like, oh, okay, I see what you're doing. And as she explains this, Rati is listening and she's like, hold on, something's happening here. So she takes this concept and applies it to breaking logograms into sections. A large tank of wax was suspended above and just ahead of the writing knives. Rati drew the observer's attention to the bright curved mirrors placed around the tank that gathered the rays of sun to melt the wax blocks in the tank. As the tank shuttled back and forth, the melted wax dripped through 10 spigots to end up as soft, doughy dollops on 10 unwinding silk scrolls. Blocks of ice placed under the scrolls and Silkmotic-powered spinning fans at the sides instantly cooled the wax into solid blocks ready to be carved. The wax must be cooled quickly because the writing engines are so much faster than human scribes, even scribes playing with zithers, said Rati. 10 sets of writing knives, as though wielded by miniature Kokru sword dancers, spun through the air and bit into the rough wax blocks. Carving, slicing, chopping, smoothing, hacking, gouging, drilling, whittling. Columns of neat Ano logograms began to take shape, perfect facsimiles of Lady Soto Zindu's singular hand. And Soto's watching and is just like, this is so weird. This is my handwriting, but they're doing it. And I was thinking how weird that would be. Like, I type, and I can see my own words come out in text that is completely separate from my own handwriting. But I have never input my handwriting into a computer and had it made into a font, which I know is a thing that you can do. And it would just be really fascinating to see somebody use a program like that and be able to create a whole series of sentences that maybe I never wrote at all, but it fucking looks like I did enough that it might even trick me. So yeah, eventually she gets to the part about the aculeum eye and how she broke it into individual cells that can only see a piece of the picture. I call this the book mirror, declared Rati. It's an insubstantial scribe that makes perfect facsimiles. And Farah is just honestly, everything that we think of, you guys have found a way to do it. Is there anything that you can't figure out? And Savo says, no mechanical wonder can ever replace the joy of sharing one's breast hoard with the mirror of one's soul. And honestly, you need to stop because that is a little bit too much, Savo. I appreciate that you are clearly a romantic, but ew, that was a little sickening. I like you, but tone it down. So, all right, I'm going to wrap this up, but I'm sorry if this came across as really negative. Like I said, I actually enjoy the broad strokes of the forward movement in the plot in these chapters. I just feel like it was cluttered with some things that felt over-explained. There was at least 5 or 6 pages in the explanation of things that I just skipped over. So I hope you all understand. Anyway, I'm going to wrap up. Thank you all again for listening. Thank you, Kyle, for commissioning these. Forgive me, Kyle. And until next time, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
Unspoiled Network podcast.